Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Bess Mayer, events coordinator at Book Bar. We are an independent bookstore on Tennyson Street in Denver, which is an cultural district in Denver. We're so excited to be here to help welcome Pam Houston, author of Deep Creek and many other wonderful novels. We love being a part of events like these, especially in this era of COVID, which has brought so many changes to how we do business. We love having people in the store for events, eating and drinking and browsing, but until we can have in-person events again, we love staying connected with you all through virtual events. We are open for curbside pickup at our front window and ship to home orders, and we're even open for browsing in store, and reservations are recommended for that. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Broomfield Library to get the event started. If you'd like to order Deep Creek, you can click on the link that they provide, and that will take you to Book Bar and you can order. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Broomfield Library's One Book, One Broomfield program. I am Catherine Lineup, the Director of Library Services and Cultural Affairs for the City and County of Broomfield. One Book, One Broomfield is a community-wide program in which success relies on the contributions and collaborations of many. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank those who helped make this year's program possible. To the One Book Steering Committee, your hard work and passion for the One Book, One Broomfield program is what makes it all possible. Thank you so much for everything you do. In addition to the committee, support was received for this year's event from the Broomfield Library Friends Foundation, Broomfield Enterprise, the Book Bar, and all of our many volunteers who have assisted with this year's program. None of this would be possible without the talented, hardworking City and County of Broomfield staff. Thank you all for bringing your best every day for Broomfield. One quick note, there will be signed copies of Deep Creek that are available for purchase online from Book Bar. Please just enter the word book plate into the shopping cart comments box when checking out, and they will make sure to send you a signed copy. And now it is my great privilege to introduce a big fan of the One Book program, Mayor Pat Quinn, who will say a few words and introduce our guest author. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
As mayor and on behalf of the City and County of Broomfield, I welcome you to the 15th One Book, One Broomfield Community Reading Program. This year's selection is Deep Creek, Finding Hope in the High Country by Pam Houston, an invigorating account of Houston's experiences on her 120-acre ranch high in the Colorado Rockies. Pam Houston is the award-winning author of novels, short stories, and personal essays. In addition to writing, Pam teaches at the Institute for American Indian Arts, is a professor of English at UC Davis, and co-founder and creative director of Writing by Writers. Her stories have been selected for volumes of the O. Henry Awards, the Pushcart Prize, Best American Travel Writing, and Best American Short Stories of the Century, among other anthologies. She is the winner of the Western States Book Award, the Willow Award for Contemporary Fiction, the Evil Companions Literary Award, and several teaching awards. Deep Creek, Finding Hope in the High Country is a deeply personal memoir full of bravery, reflection, and beautiful prose. I'm normally an advocate for one book to be nonfiction, and I read all three of the finalist books this year, but I must say I was completely engaged by Deep Creek and its deeper message about taking care of our planet. I love Colorado. I love the mountains. Even though I have done 5 Ride the Rockies, I had never been to Creed until 2014. It's a slice of heaven, and the valleys and mountains are inspiring. Pam captures it all in this wonderful book, but also captures the perils of living in the mountains during global warming. The chapters on the fires threatening her homestead are written in vivid detail, and I felt I was there with her. I also want to take a moment and thank the people of the One Book, One Broomfield Selection Committee. I really appreciate the work and effort you did in selecting this great book. So thank you very much. Now I'm pleased to present Pam Houston.
Well, hello, Broomfield. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Book Bar. Shout out to Book Bar. Great addition to the Denver community. Wonderful bookstore. It's my great honor to be here. When Esther first wrote me and said that the committee was considering Deep Creek, it made me so happy because Deep Creek was one book, one town in a few other states, but not Colorado. So I'm delighted to be here. I wish we could all be here together. But thank you so much for choosing Deep Creek so that it got to be one book, one town in my home state. It's really meaningful to me, and I'm grateful. All right, well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to read a little bit of it to you, and then I'll be very happy to answer your questions. Deep Creek was born when my editor at my longtime publisher, W.W. Norton, said to me, "We would like you to go on a book-length adventure. Would you do that for us and write about it?" And I had done 5 books with Norton previously. They had always sort of let me do whatever I wanted book-wise. And so I thought, sure, I can do what they are asking of me. And I'm an adventuring spirit, so I thought, well, yeah, I'll make a list of adventures and I'll pick one that feels the most like a book. And I really did make a list. I thought it would be really cool to mush dogs on Antarctica, actually. That was high on the list. I've always wanted to sail the coast of Turkey. And, and on the list went. And then one day I was driving home. I teach about 10 weeks of the year in Davis, California. And I was driving home from Davis to my ranch in southwestern Colorado after 10 weeks of being there. And I always drive across Highway 50, the loneliest road across Nevada, and the dogs are with me, my big Irish wolfhounds. And we always stop and take walks up the Forest Service roads, and the dogs can tell we're going home. They know the second we get onto what I think of as the leashless side of the Sierras. And I was walking the dogs, and we were all excited about getting to come home after 10 weeks in California. And I just thought to myself, I'm already having my book-length adventure. I don't really need to go to Antarctica or sail the coast of Turkey, though I would like to. My book-length adventure started 27 years ago now when I sold my first book, which was called Cowboys Are My Weakness, to W.W. Norton for $21,000. I mention the amount because it's important later in the story, but also because I was a graduate student making $4,500 a year, and $21,000 seemed like more money than I would ever have again. And so I got in my car. When my agent handed me the check, she said, "Don't spend it all on hiking boots," because she knew me pretty well. And so I took the check and I drove all around the American West looking for a place to call home, looking for some land to put that $21,000 down on. And I really drove the whole Rocky Mountain West and the Northwest as well. And I had lived in Colorado before that. I had lived in the Fraser Valley before I went to graduate school and wrote my first book. And I had driven one of the blue buses in Winter Park, which are probably familiar to a lot of you, and I had worked at a restaurant called Fred and Sophie's, and I had worked daycare. I had worked several jobs for 3 years so that I could ski 100 days a year. So I was familiar with Colorado, and then I went to graduate school in Utah. So Colorado felt a little bit like a homecoming, and I had actually thought I was going to choose somewhere different because I had already lived in Colorado. But once I got back to Colorado, I just thought, oh yeah, this is the best state. I forgot because I'd been in Utah, which I also loved in a different way for the years I was in grad school. But anyway, I got back to Colorado, visited some friends in Denver, happened to be taken, I only tell this part of the story in Colorado, but happened to be taken to the Colorado Rockies doubleheader in Mile High Stadium, the old Mile High Stadium, on the day they were setting the all-time baseball yearly attendance record. And that was super fun. That was on a Tuesday. And on the Monday before, I had been taken to Monday night Raiders Broncos. And I was like, oh yeah, I love Colorado, I forgot. So I started to look a little more seriously in Colorado, and I got to Creede, this little town that a couple of other writers, Robert Boswell and Antonia Nelson, a couple of writer friends of mine, had told me about Creede. They had family property in Telluride, and they had looked over in Creede, and they said, Creede's a pretty cool town, check it out. So I went to Creede, got invited to a wedding right off the bat, met a real estate lady at the wedding, and she took me out and around. I also met 3 women in Creede who were all living there, single, doing their own thing. One of them was Jenny Inge, who some of you probably know. She makes jewelry out of silver and horsehair, and she's had her shop in Creede for many, many years. Another was a girl who had opened a coffee shop, long gone now from Creede, and another was a young woman who had opened a flower shop. And everyone in Creede was supporting them. They're like, well, no one ever took flowers to anybody, but now they do because she's here. And I just thought that was really cool. I thought you could be a single woman in Creede doing your own thing, and everyone would support you. So I got taken around, saw a lot of things that weren't right for me, saw a lot of 5-acre lots that I could afford. Now, keep in mind, I only had $21,000. So she showed me a bunch of 5-acre lots that, you know, where the wind blew all the time, and a couple of shacks in town that were kind of held together with paper and string. And then she said, you know, I should take you out to see the Blair Ranch. And I said, sure. And she said, oh, but, you know, a single woman like you living all the way out at the end of a 12-mile dirt road, you don't want to do that. And I said, I might. And she said, well, you know, frankly, you can't afford it. And I said, okay, all right, no problem. So she took me back to town. I got in my car. I got out the map, looking at Ouray or Silverton, the next place down the road. And this tall, belt-buckle-wearing cowboy came and knocked on my window. And he's like, I hear you want to see the Blair Ranch. And I said, okay. And so off we went in his pickup truck to the Blair Ranch. Donna Blair was recently widowed, and she was selling it. Got there, it was 120 acres of high mountain meadow, the most beautiful piece of ground I'd ever seen. It had a horseshoe of 12,000-foot mountains around it. It stood at 9,000 feet. It was mostly meadow with little islands of aspen and blue spruce on it. The Rio Grande ran right across the front of it, and a couple of creeks came down through it. It had the most beautiful barn that was 100 years old and a very simple log house. Anyway, it was also the 3rd week of September. I forgot to say that. So you know what the mountainsides were doing. And it was just the most glorious thing I'd ever seen. I fell instantly in love with it. And my $21,000 represented just under 5% down of the asking price. Now, I was basically just out of grad school. Everything I owned was in my Toyota Corolla, including my dog. I didn't know very much about real estate, but I knew just under 5% down wasn't good. I didn't have a job. I had this book, Cowboys Are My Weakness, that was out in the world, and it was doing really well. But I didn't have 3 pages of another book to rub together, and I'd already been paid for Cowboys. And so, not knowing that you're supposed to lie to real estate agents, I just told the truth. And the guy, the real estate cowboy guy, said, you know, I think Donna Blair is going to like the idea of you. So why don't you give me a signed copy of Cowboys Are My Weakness and your $21,000, and I'll see what I can do. And a few days later, Donna Blair sold me the ranch for $21,000 and a signed copy of Cowboys. And I bought it for the adrenaline rush it gave me, and because I was in love with it, really not knowing how I was going to pay for it. The most important thing to say is that Donna carried the note herself, because any bank in the world would have laughed at me. And I guess in a way, her faith in me gave me faith in myself, something like that. And then over the next 27 years, that 120 acres became the story of my life. And it taught me how to show up. I raised horses and donkeys and Icelandic sheep and chickens and Irish wolfhounds. It taught me how to give a horse a shot in the middle of the night in a blizzard. It taught me how to sweep my own chimney and repair my own roof and my own fences. It taught me that I could go to the hardware store 3 or 4 times and eventually come back with the right thing. You know, we're kind of out there alone, and I had neighbors who were kind to me and helped me out when I was in a real jam, pulled my truck out of the ditch or whatever. But it grew me up, and over time it became the story of my life. It also gave me a safe place to be, which I had never had in my life. I grew up in a super violent alcoholic household. Both my parents were drunks, and my dad was violent and abusive. And so home had never had a nice ring to it before. And so I was making my own home and making a safe place. There's only a few more things to say, and then I'll read you a little bit. One is that during the 2013 West Fork fire, which, I mean, now fires are so commonplace, and I know you've just had a couple near here. And I was here a few weeks ago in the middle of them. But at the time of the West Fork fire, it was the largest fire in southwestern Colorado's history. I guess it still is that at this moment. And I thought I would lose the ranch. I had fire on 3 sides of me at one point, and there's a chapter in here about that. But in the middle of that fire, on the 4th of July, which was when my 6-month mortgage payment was due, I took down at Blair the final check for the ranch. And so I paid it off, not knowing in my writer's mind whether that was going to make it more likely to burn down or less likely to burn down. But it didn't burn down. The mountain behind it did, but it didn't. And I did pay it off. And the other thing that's a little bit interesting is that Deep Creek came out in February of 2019, and I started on my initial book tour on January 24th of that year. And on January 23rd of that year, all of the paperwork came together for me to be able to sign the papers to put it into a land easement, a land trust, as I was literally leaving town for 3 months to go on this book tour. So it felt like I had preserved it kind of in the nick of time. I did a lot of things wrong at the ranch over the years, nothing cataclysmic or catastrophic, but it was a very steep learning curve. But I feel like in the end I did right by it, because now it's protected by Wright, the Rio Grande Land Trust Company. So that's about what I have to say about the book. I guess one more thing I'll say before I read is that, because there's probably some writers out there in the audience too, I turned in the first copy of this book. My editor and my agent had all said to me, this book should be all ranch all the time. We don't want to know about your crappy childhood. We don't want to know about your bad boyfriends. This is going to be like, this was sort of a joke, not really. They said, a year in Provence in Colorado. So I wrote that book where it was all ranch all the time. It was all splitting wood. It was all baling hay. It was all bluebirds and the Perseid meteor shower and lambs being born. All the stuff that's still in the book, absolutely. But I turned it in and nobody liked it. I didn't like it and they didn't like it. And that's when we realized I did have to tell the story of my childhood in this a little bit, because it made the ranch more meaningful. And while I was at it, while I was adding this stuff from my childhood that made the ranch a haven or a place of safety, during those revisions was kind of the moment when I woke up. This is now 4 or 5 years ago. Really woke up to how how we were in climate free fall, like climate catastrophe was not something that was way out there. Like we were in it here in the Southwest, which they told us we would be, 10 or 15 years ago. And so basically all that scaffolding of the book of hay and lambs and horses and winter and snow and broken pipes and all of that was still the scaffolding of the book, but my childhood kind of came from this side and the climate catastrophe came from this side, and they met in the middle, and then it really turned into a book. Anyway, I'm going to read to you The Season of Hunkering Down, which is one of the shortest chapters in the book, but I think it represents it well. By the 1st of October, the aspens are done showing off for the year. First dusting of snow on the peaks, then first dusting of snow on the pasture. The color is almost gone, and with it, the tourists. My neighbors from the Sourd Ranch have moved into town for the winter. For the next several months, I'll be the last occupied house on my road. The horses hang around the corral looking a little grim. They know what's coming. I've all but missed this year's color change in the high country, so even though there's much to be done to prepare for winter, this morning, Fenton, William, and I take a hike up to Phoenix Park, one of the most wind-protected places in the valley, hoping to find a few groves of aspen still holding their leaves. We climb for an hour in light drizzle, and under my boot soles is a carpet of green and gold. We surprise a mule deer buck, a 4-pointer, at the place where the forest gives way to meadow. When we reach the waterfall at the top of the park, the sun peeks through the clouds just long enough to turn the whole scene Kodachrome. The heavy gunmetal sky, the ghost aspens with only a fraction of their leaves left glowing like a fluorescent pencil sketch beneath it, the water tumbling down the face of the cliff, beads of it lit up against the dark rock and spinning earthward like fireflies. In the summertime, this trail sees a fair amount of use, from hikers and horsemen, sometimes four-wheelers, and even the occasional 4x4 truck. But summer feels long over, and we are between hunting seasons, so the dogs and I have the place to ourselves. Years ago, on an August hike, right at the tail end of the monsoon, I got caught in a thunderstorm halfway across the big meadow that leads to Phoenix Park. I was new to the valley, and had not yet learned how a bright white micropuff in one corner of the sky can morph into a cumulonimbic monster in the amount of time it takes to go around a couple of bends in the trail. If you've never gotten caught in a thunderstorm at high altitude, if you have never felt your long, straight hair stand on end as if someone above you has strings attached to it, if you have never smelled sulfur in the air just before a crack you can feel at the center of your rib cage splits the sky in two, if you have never run between lightning bolts that are hitting the ground on every side of you, your brain racing to determine whether you will improve or diminish your odds of surviving if you take 5 seconds to unbuckle your pack and throw its contents, including your stainless steel water bottle, to the ground, then you might not understand what a pleasure it is to hike that same trail in October on a cool, dry day where the odds of a thunderstorm, while not impossible, are about 10,000 to 1. After a snack and a long drink out of that same time-tested steel water bottle, the dogs and I make our way back down the trail, smelling not sulfur, but the slow rot of dying leaves in a dry climate and the occasional tang of pine pitch. An immature bald eagle rides a thermal down canyon, and it's windless enough that I can hear sun-warmed rocks, newly freed from last night's frost, slip and settle in the big scree field across the creek that rises up toward Wasson Park. In the house I grew up in, fall marked the start of the most dangerous season. My mother dreaded the snow and ice and the perpetually gray skies of a mid-Atlantic winter. Either she never learned how to buy a serious winter coat or her vanity wouldn't allow it. She played indoor tennis, but the reservations were expensive and in high demand, so she didn't get enough exercise for her to justify the few food calories a day she normally ingested, and her perpetual hunger was the loudest thing in our house. The shortening days meant she drank more and started earlier. By the end of September, she was headed into a tailspin from which she would not emerge until the crocuses came up in the spring. By the time my mother died in 1993, the drug Prozac had been taken by more than 10 million people. And yet I don't believe the word depression had ever been uttered in my childhood home until once during fall break of my junior year of college, I told my mother I had started taking advantage of Denison's free psychological services. A boy I had befriended from my geology class was showing strong self-destructive tendencies. He had just left a severed pig's head in the ice machine of one of the all-female dorms. And I'd made the appointment hoping to get advice on how I might help him. After giving me advice, the therapist, a kind, smart, and soft-spoken man by the name of Jeff Pollard, asked simply, "And how are you feeling these days?" I felt my body go utterly still for the count of 1, 2, 3, and then I burst into sobs that lasted upward of 10 minutes. I can still feel that office around me as if it were yesterday. The leather books, tall ceilings, and high windows through which I could see all the trees on the quad ablaze in fall color. I can still feel my dawning understanding that therapy was a thing that had been invented to, among other applications, help people who had suffered exactly the sorts of things I had suffered at the hands of my father. Even then, it had taken many sessions for Dr. P to convince me it was okay to accept that help. My mother and I were driving back from an unsuccessful trip to the mall. I had arrived at my parents' house wearing a peasant blouse and a long, colorful, hand-painted skirt I'd bought for more than I could afford at an art fair. She said the skirt made me look fat, and we'd go buy something she could stand to look at me in. I had fended off several pencil skirts and dart-heavy blouses, as well as a few items designed by Liz Claiborne. We hadn't exactly stopped speaking to each other, so after 10 minutes of car silence, I decided to tell her about Dr. P. He says I suffer from PTSD, which manifests in bouts of depression and low-level anxiety. But the good news is he doesn't think I'll need drugs. He thinks the talking will work. My mother kept her eyes on the road, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch slightly. I wasn't sure about it at first, I said, but now each week I find myself looking forward to the hour I spend in his office. I fiddled with my seatbelt. Dr. P says I'm learning to hear the sound of my own voice. Depression, huh? My mother said, louder than I expected. I'd been hoping she'd ask me what the letters PTSD stood for. You know what we did for depression when I was your age? Drank, I managed not to say. Drank, she said, her eyes shooting to the car clock, confirming that we were, in fact, at least 30 minutes past cocktail hour. Back at the ranch after our hike, I give a couple of hours to one of the larger fall projects, coating the exterior logs with UV protector. At 9,000 feet at this latitude, the UV eats through everything over the course of the summer. Paint, plastic, enamel, and if I don't reprotect them every fall, the logs themselves. The instructions on the giant can warn it takes the coating 24 hours to seal correctly, and during that 24 hours, it must not encounter rain, dew, or temperatures below 40 degrees. It always gets below 40 degrees at the ranch at night, except sometimes in July during the monsoon. However bad cold is for the sealant, I feel certain half an inch of rain in 45 minutes would be worse. If we're not in a drought year, it dews heavily every night and everything freezes solid. Given the impossibility of following the instructions on the can, I slap some coating on the logs in the heat of every afternoon and hope to get the whole house covered before the snow flies. The air at the ranch is thin, dry, and cold. And the snowstorms get stuck in the dip and swirl of the basin, turning back and back again on themselves, sometimes dropping as much as 4 inches an hour. On any given morning from the 1st of October on out, I might wake to frozen ground and flurries. By dinner time, the split rail fences might have all gone under, and I might not see the tops of them again until March. That will be the day that launches 4 solid months of worry. For my elderly geldings, DeSeo and Roni, who get so stiff standing on that frozen moonscape with their achy old man legs, they sometimes won't eat, won't even take the short walk to the water trough. for the mini donkeys, Simon and Isaac, who are far younger than the horses but no taller than the split-rail fences. In the biggest blizzards, they have to power through the pasture like Tonka trucks, leaving their belly marks in the fresh powder. I spend too many hours imagining them high-centered in a drift some howling night, their little legs spinning and spinning but gaining no purchase at all. I worry about my Icelandic sheep, especially Jordan, my best ewe, who has a healthy lamb of her own each year and is always willing to nurse the orphans. She's prone to respiratory illness, brought on by sudden cold snaps. I worry about my chickens, who tend to attack one another in extreme weather of any kind. What edges out the worry, of course, is the wonder, because what could be better than 48 inches in 24 hours? Than a couple of Irish wolfhounds leaping through bottomless powder with giant smiles on their faces, than a herd of 200 elk making their stately way chest-deep in the snowbound pasture toward the river. Best of all, what accompanies each snowstorm is the knowledge that the aquifer is getting replenished, that summer wildfire fear is assuaged, if not abated, that the rivers will be full of trout and the pastures full of flowers come July. The autumn I was 25, I flew from graduate school in Utah to my parents' house in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, something I did with relative consistency up until my mother died. Downstairs in the TV room, my father and I were watching the Phillies get beat up by the Mets when the phone rang and my mother answered it upstairs. A few minutes later, we heard her banging around with some fervor. My father leaned toward me, said, "Go see what your mother's up to, will you?" In her bedroom, she was packing a small suitcase. "What's going on?" I asked her. "That was Jean," my mother said, without looking at me. "Jean as in your sister?" I asked. In the quarter century I had been on the planet, I had maybe heard my mother say her sister's name 5 times. "Yeah," she said. "My father's dying in a hospital in Florida, and he says he wants to shake my hand." I looked at my mother for signs of fracture, but as she gathered her makeup into a little cloth case with red foxes printed on it, she seemed exactly as she had before. If my mother had mentioned Jean 5 times in my life, it was 5 more times than she had talked about her father. The story I'd been told was that on the very same day my mother's mother died in childbirth, her father abandoned the girls. Aunt Ermie and Uncle Marion, who had never wanted anything to do with children, agreed to raise them. Less than a year after my mother ran away to Broadway, Jean joined her as a way to get out of their sad and angry house. They had a sister act at first and eventually went abroad with USO. Even though Jean was older, my mother had always been the wilder sister. When showbiz got too unruly for Jean, she returned to Spiceland, Indiana, found religion, and married her high school sweetheart. My mother had told me, but only once, that Jean had never forgiven my mother for corrupting her, for luring her to the big city, tarnishing her reputation, and ruining her life. The sisters stopped speaking when Jean returned to Indiana, and as far as my father or I knew, this was the first time Jean had made contact in more than 40 years. "So what are you going to do?" I asked, though the suitcase was making the answer apparent. "I'm going down there," she said. "I've never laid eyes on the man, and this is apparently my last chance." "You want me to go with you, or drive you to the airport?" I offered, something about her matter-of-fact tone scaring me a little. No, stay here. Get your father to take you out to dinner. I won't be gone that long." The next day at nearly the same hour, the Mets taking it to the Phillies once again, my father and I heard the garage door open. My mother climbed the stairs without glancing in our direction, and my father indicated with his head. By the time I got to her room, she was already unpacking. "How'd it go?" I asked her. "What happened?" She looked at me as if I were crazy. "What do you think happened?" she said. I shook his hand. And with that, she turned back to her suitcase. I went downstairs to watch the 9th inning. A few minutes later, we heard her in the kitchen, starting dinner, humming one of her old torch songs, mixing herself a drink. I finished coating nearly the entire west side of the house with an hour to go before sunset. If I extend my ladder fully and stand on the 2nd step from the top, I can reach all but the 4 logs closest to the peak, and those logs are protected from the worst of the sun's rays by the roof's eaves anyway. Because I have not successfully taught William to dial 911, I leave it each year at that. Tomorrow, I will get on the roof with a coarse bristled round brush and the series of screw-in poles that allow me to sweep my chimney. I will force that brush from the top of the chimney all the way down into the basement and scrub for all I am worth for a good 20 minutes. Then I will climb down from the roof with my face and arms blackened by soot, relatively secure in the knowledge that if this turns out to be the winter that ends all winters, at least we have begun it clean and creosote-free. About 6 months and 4 cords of wood from now, there will be an April night so warm it will seem like overkill to build a fire. The next morning, I will open the windows to air out my bedroom and closet. I will hear the hum and whir of the automatic pump in the basement as it gets to work on the water that has inevitably seeped inside as 120 acres of snow turns to liquid and then tries to displace itself. I will trade my snowshoes for my extra toughs because almost overnight the pasture will have turned from mostly snow to mostly muck. As I zigzag across it, trying to stay out of the deepest mud, I will spot a flash of blue so simultaneously bright and deep it won't quite make sense in this late winter color scheme of bare branches, dusky clouds, and dirty ice. The Rocky Mountain bluebirds will have arrived, only the males at first, scouting my pasture for a nesting place. I'll watch the bluebirds flit along the fence line, hear the warble high and clear, and I'll know the 35 below zero nights are over, that there will be one more big dump of snow so heavy the horses will go on a water strike rather than slog through it to the trough, but it will melt in a matter of days. And before too long, there will be tiny buds on the aspen trees. The ice-choked river will run free again, and a green so subtle I think I might be imagining it will tint first the yard, then the pasture. The horses' spines will relax all the way to their tails. The chickens will venture out of the coop, and even the coyotes' barks will seem lazier, a little less hungry, a little less lonely. The wild iris will push up through the soil, and the roan, whose winter coat is burgundy wine, will shed out to a bright, barely speckled gray. In a matter of weeks, the paint-by-number landscape will have filled in around that first flash of blue. Pale green aspen leaf, crimson paintbrush, purple lupin, red-tailed hawk. A few days after we talked about depression, my mother came into my room while I was sleeping, took the hand-painted skirt out of my closet, washed it in hot water, took the waistband in, and then returned it without a word. When I went to put it on for my return flight, all of the beautiful colors were muted, and it was a length that had never been and would never be in style. I put my jeans back on and stuck my head in her bedroom with the skirt in my hand. Why can't you like me the way I am? I leaned against the door jamb, trying to look calm. There were rules against such questions in my household, and I knew it. Is that the kind of thing they teach you to say in therapy? She said. I guess maybe it is, I said. Her eyes were focused, as usual, on herself in her makeup mirror. I gave up everything I loved for you, she said, for maybe the 500 millionth time. I'm sorry, I said, and I was. There were so many things that made my mother sad. The weather, my wardrobe, the choices she made, most notably, it turned out, having me. I want to write here that I understand, that I know she did her best, that there was no one in her early life to teach her how to love, how to take responsibility, how to be something other than a victim of the circumstances life had dealt her. And as I write the words, I can see that they are true. But the other thing I need to say is this. For all of my childhood and throughout my teens, I prayed to have myself sucked right back up into the ether because I thought it might give my mother back her hopes and dreams and joy. But the universe wouldn't make that trade with me. And so my mother died, drunk and unhappy, and I found my way to this ranch, this place where I protect and am protected by animals, this place where nature controls how I spend my days and how I spend my life, this place where I can love every season. When the sun sets tonight, the temperature will drop in 30 minutes from 55 to 38. They're calling for a cold front to move through the valley, and if they're right, Tonight we'll get our first truly hard frost. I've got a pot of green chili stew on simmer and the dogs are snoring by the wood stove. There's nothing I would trade this for. Now, let it snow. Thank you very much for listening. So I think we're going to take questions in a second. Here come the questions.
Okay, first question. When did you know you wanted to be a writer?
When did I know I wanted to be a writer? So one of the chapters in Deep Creek is about this lady named Martha Washington. My mother had me by cesarean and then wanted to go to a party, which is both the good news and the bad news about my mother. And she went to the hospital bulletin board and looked for babysitting. And she found this lady named Martha Washington, who literally came to the hospital on my second night of life to hang out with me while my mother went to a party and then came back to the hospital. And Martha, the best thing that ever happened to me is that Martha fell in love with me and basically stayed around till I was 20. And she made me love books and stories. She taught me to read when I was 2.5. By the time I went to nursery school, they brought me up to read to the third graders. I loved words and I loved stories. And I started writing very, very young, like before memory. You know, of course, not writing very well. But I didn't exactly know that a writer was something you could be. You know, I wrote kind of in the same way I slept and went for walks and ate. It was a thing I did to process the world and make the world make sense to me in my kind of chaotic home. And also to honor and love the natural world, even back there in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, you know, where there is some natural world. And I wrote about the trees and I wrote about the ocean and, you know, again, not well, but it was what I did, you know, and then in order to be a writer, I understood, you know, you had to get published or you had to go to school for it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I did wind up going to school and majoring in English and going to graduate school at the University of Utah for a creative writing PhD. So, you know, somewhere in there, but the main thing to say is that I was always going to be a writer. Like whether I got published or not was a whole nother set of questions. But I started writing before I remember, you know, probably when I was 4, literally, or 5.
All right, thanks. Next question. The Colorado wildfires have once again been devastating to our state. What did you learn from your experience with the 2013 West Fork fire that might be helpful to those who are going through the same thing now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually was I was in Boulder, and I drove over Trail Ridge Road the day that the Cameron Peak fire, the second time it exploded, the more recent time. And it was, I mean, even, like I've seen some bad fires, and it was amazing. A couple things I've learned. I mean, there's like 2 categories of things I've learned. I've learned some really practical things, like, you know, what I used to think was close isn't close at all. You know, I used to think like 5 miles away was close, and suddenly I understand that, you know, a half a mile away can be far, depending on what's between you and the fire. I learned the way aspen trees have water in their trunks, and if you have aspen trees between you and a fire, you're better off than if you don't. I also learned that firefighters are amazingly dedicated individuals, and we spent a whole summer with them that year, 2013. I know you guys have too. So I guess what I would say overall on the positive side about fire is that I learned that you can have a lot of information and it will help you make decisions. You know, I know that in the moment a big fire blows up, it can seem like everything's in chaos. But in fact, you know, there's tried and true practices that generally speaking, will help you make good decisions. And that, like having a body of knowledge about wildland fire has really helped me feel safer living there. And that's kind of why I wanted to write the chapter the way I did, which is with all this information from the NC Web and all this information from the glossary of wildland firefighting terms. That's all included in my chapter because I wanted to kind of educate my reader in the same way I was educated during the fire. I wanted the reader to have that same experience. On the other side, what I learned is that we got to stop driving motorhomes that get 2 miles to the gallon, and we got to get out of airplanes. And I mean, I'm very guilty of being a frequent flyer, and that's my big climate footprint, my big carbon footprint, is how much time I used to spend on airplanes in the before times, because I'm a traveler and I also travel to work. And it's been amazing. I haven't been on an airplane since January, and I thought, honestly, oh my God, who will I be if I'm not getting on an airplane every 2 weeks? Because I'm good at it. I'm good at negotiating travel, or I'm new cities or whatever. And in fact, I haven't missed it. And in fact, it didn't define me. And so it seems to me that this time of COVID, which I know is not what you asked, but it seems this time of COVID is really an opportunity for us to think really hard about what we can live without. Because I think if we don't start living without our giant gas-guzzling toys and this idea that we can be anywhere in a couple hours, you know, we're gonna have more fires and a lot of other things. And so I think this kind of COVID pause is asking us to think about ourselves as creatures on the earth who need clean air and water and need not to have our houses burned down and, you know, need to be able to breathe.
Thank you. Some of your stories in Deep Creek are incredibly emotional, and I can imagine that it takes a lot of vulnerability to write a memoir and present it to the world. As readers, we love your vulnerability and thank you for your work. Did you ever have doubts or worries about publishing this or any of your other pieces of work? Was it daunting to write down some of your most vulnerable moments, or did it come naturally?
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, when I said at the beginning that, you know, I turned in Deep Creek and it was all ranch stuff and my editor didn't like it. And my agent said to me, "Isn't this the book where you really say what happened to you as a child?" And my response to her was, "God, have I done anything else my whole career? It seems like that's all I ever do." And she said, "No, you haven't really written about it in a plain-spoken way. You're always couching it in dream or metaphor or fiction. Like, what if you just wrote about the abuse the same way you write about baling hay or chopping wood?" And I thought, oh, I can do that. Like, it didn't seem very hard, honestly. I mean, I've had a lot of therapy, of course, and I speak at women's groups and, you know, battered women's groups and that kind of thing. So I'm kind of used to telling that story, but I hadn't ever written it in a really plain-spoken way. So that, I think, was good. I'm not sure if I would have written it that way before my parents passed away. I think maybe that was part of why I was always writing it in metaphor or dream. But it was good to write it. It wasn't that hard. You know, it was honestly harder to write about Fenton's death and also that whale that's late in the book, Tangled in a Net. I mean, that almost killed me to write it. Whereas writing about stuff that happened to me, I guess I'm sort of desensitized to it because of therapy. It was weird, I will say this, when I was on tour for Deep Creek and I was talking about it night after night after night after night, and then talking about my father a little bit, usually because people ask night after night after night after night, that was kind of weird. Like, I'd be in my 8th city in a week, and I'd be like, wow, this is a lot of talk about my abusive father. But the actual writing of those scenes was not that hard. Not, like I said, not as hard as writing Fenton's death or The Whale, which for whatever reason was the hardest thing to write in this book. And then, you know, I'll just say one more thing about that, which is that Usually I'm way more worried about someone else that I've exposed, honestly, than my own vulnerability. Like, I'm kind of a person who'll get on an airplane, as I mentioned, and like tell the person next to me like what's going on. You know, I'm not a really private person, and I love to connect with people, and I think my mechanism for connecting is to tell something vulnerable, and then they'll tell me something vulnerable. Like, that's kind of how I move through the world. And so, but I do really worry in every book that I've said something about someone that is going to be hurtful to them. And, you know, and sometimes I just have to. And sometimes, I mean, the story demands it, and there's no way to soften it. And sometimes things hurt them that I don't think will, and something that I do think will hurt them doesn't. So I'm not like all-seeing about that. So that's the kind of stuff I think about a lot before I publish. And I do something called a compassion read at the end, like right before I turn something in, and I think, did I really need to take that shot? And, you know, I'm from New Jersey, and that's what we do in New Jersey. We take shots. So sometimes the answer is yes, but sometimes the answer is no. Like, so, you know how like when you meet a person and you're so sure they're so annoying, and then you realize they're annoying you because they're doing something that you do all the time? It's kind of like that. That's what my compassion read is about. It's about seeing if I can't self-implicate or I can't take responsibility for this conflict somehow, because often that's the truer story.
We've got another question from one of our online viewers. She asks, can you please talk about your relationship to animals? She was struck by the story of your ranch sitter slaughtering your lamb and wonders how you would reconcile your love of animals with eating meat.
Ah, sure. Well, yeah, I love animals. I love animals truly. Animals have taught me so much about how to live. I am a meat eater. I have a lot of, you know, friends who have different feelings than I do. Either they're vegan or they're sort of anti-vegan because they believe that we're not going to save the earth by eating vegetables. I wish I had a good answer for this. I guess I would say that that I was a hunting guide for a long time, and I met a lot of hunters who felt that because they ate meat and because they understood the relationship between predators and game, they felt they had to hunt to understand that better, so they weren't just going to the grocery store and buying their packaged meat. And I guess I fall down in that category somewhere. You know, I raise animals, sometimes I eat them, and I think there's real beauty in that if you do it responsibly. I would also say, though, that there are 7 things. I mean, this is a book I just helped a guy edit who's putting out this book about the 7 things you can do, 7 things we can all do to combat climate change. And there's 7 really good things that we really honestly all can do. And one of them is a vegetable-heavy diet. And I have definitely gone to that. You know, I do eat meat and probably will continue to. I'm anemic, and there's some other reasons why I feel that I need to eat meat. I'm also gluten intolerant, which makes it harder not to eat meat. But I have reduced my meat intake over the years, probably by 70%. And that's kind of a number that feels good to me, honestly.
Thanks. We have another question from another viewer who mentions that your stories about your animals and their personalities are some of their favorite parts of Deep Creek. Was there a story that you really wanted to put into the book but didn't, or do you have new personality-filled animal stories to share since the book was published?
I do. You know, the thing about living with animals is that the stories never stop. And Roni, who's featured in this book, died right after I turned it in. He actually died before the book came out. And he died a beautiful death. Like, if there's such a thing as a good death, Roni died it. He basically died with his head in my lap at dawn, and he felt fine until the day he lied down, and he was 40 years old. So that's a really good death for a horse. And I wrote about that in Outside Magazine. Just during the pandemic, we had a little ram whose mother rejected him, and his horns were all messed up, continue to be. But I kept him alive one very cold night early in the pandemic because it seemed like it was this tiny thing I could do in the face of all these hundreds of thousands of deaths, which at that time wasn't yet, but it was thousands of deaths. And I wrote that essay for this pandemic anthology called Alone Together, which is kind of a cool little book. If you haven't seen it, I bet they have it at Book Bar. But yeah, the animals never stop making stories, honestly. And so I will always have more animal stories as long as I live with animals. People say, like, how do you get story material if you're always holed up at the ranch, which I really wasn't until the pandemic, but now I really am. And the answer is, like, the animals are just constant story makers. They really are.
You talk about your love of traveling in Deep Creek. What is the first place you would like to go once it's safe to travel again, and why?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I haven't been asked that question, but I've been kind of thinking about it, waiting for it. I just don't know about travel anymore. That's the truth. I mean, there's so many places I want to go. I'd love to go back to Iceland. Iceland was kind of the last place I went. I was there last September, the last big place I went, and I fell completely in love with it and would love to go back and see more of it, or just really spend more time there. So that's a simple answer. The more complicated answer is I really don't know about travel. If I'm going to put my money where my mouth is about the climate, and I see that we're in catastrophe, I might not fly anymore. It's a crazy idea, but it's trying to get a hold. And it will really change how I make my living. Not entirely, but it'll change my range of living making. So I'm not ready to say I really won't fly anymore. But I'm gonna, maybe I'll reduce my flying as much as I reduce my meat. I mean, maybe that's a good number. I don't know yet. But Iceland is a place that I'd really like to go back to. I found it utterly captivating and beguiling in every way.
So since you've had so many, what has been your favorite job other than writer and rancher?
Teacher. Teacher's my favorite job more than writer and rancher. Teacher is my favorite job at all. I have the great honor of teaching at the Institute for American Indian Arts, and I was Tommy Orange's teacher, just to name one book you've probably heard of, his book There. But many, many other amazing writers who are publishing books all the time now. Therese Mayotte, Ginger Gaffney, Jake Skeets. Those are all students that I have had the pleasure to hear and work with at the Institute. I also have amazing students at UC Davis. I teach in both cases in the graduate program, so I'm really teaching emerging writers. And like, not that I'm on a climate change broken record tonight, but I really believe that these young voices and the time I put into their books and the time I put helping them get those books into the world is without question the greatest use of my time right now, because they are our hope, especially Native writers and Asian writers and Black writers, but also young people, young white people too. They're thinking really hard about everything, and we've let them down. My generation has let them down, and so I feel like the more of those voices I can amplify or help to amplify, that's my primary work these days.
Okay, this one comes from one of our viewers who is in a book club. They ask, in Deep Creek, you included some information about firefighting, which they loved, but others in their book club did not. Why did you choose to include it and in that format?
Yeah, that's good. I like that question. Well, I said a little bit about this before, but I'll say this first. It was this giant battle with my editor because no one, everyone in New York was like, well, nobody cares about fire, Like, why would we care about fire here where it rains all the time? And everyone who read the fire chapter west of the Missouri River, I guess, was like, oh, it's my favorite chapter. So it was this big, I actually cut it from 82 pages to 62 pages. I did take some of the material out as a compromise with my editor. But the main reason I wrote it the way I did is because I wanted the reader to experience the fire as similarly to the way I experienced it as possible. And when you have a fire, as I'm sure you probably know, you're just looking at the NC web all the time. It's kind of like this week where we're refreshing the election results. It's just refresh, 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 refresh. Trying to see, watching the fire perimeter, suddenly becoming an expert at reading topo maps. Like, that experience is so much part of having a fire, and I wanted to duplicate that experience. The other thing I would say, just as an artist, is that I love to bring in other voices, into my own work. And I was also really interested in the language of the NC web and the way they speak in code, high value structures and low value structures, the way they depersonalize what's actually burning down to make it more palatable. Not that that's any kind of conspiracy thought, it's just interesting the way the government talks about people's lives and people's memories and things. So all of those reasons were why I wanted to include their language. And I really had to fight for it. And it was like I said, I had to compromise a little, but I fought to keep it. So I'm glad at least some of you liked it. And honestly, the rest of you could just skip it. People were like, I got interviewed and the guy's like, I just skipped that part. I'm like, well, that's fine. That's why you paid the $25 for the book. Like, you're allowed to skip anything you want.
Okay, so we've just got a couple left here. I'm going to actually combine two of these because they're similar. Someone here, let me find it again, was wanting to know what it's like up at your ranch right now, but also how has your life changed sharing it and the ranch with Martin?
With who?
I don't know, it says Martin in the question.
It's Mike, but...
Oh, Mike, okay.
That's okay.
I'm just reading the questions.
I was like, what? Who's Martin? It depends what you mean, what it's like at the ranch right now, and I know you can't tell me. We got some snow. We had a very, very, very dry summer, terribly dry summer, as you did. We finally got some snow, and it's a lovely temperature. This is one of the most gorgeous times of year. The RVs finally went home, though they hung on a lot longer this year. It's okay, in my county, people aren't that good about wearing masks, and it's been a little depressing how mad everybody is at each other this summer. I will say that honestly, kind of about masks and money and politics. So it hasn't been a great summer there, but we've gotten out a lot, and all the animals are happy, of course. The animals are so happy to have us home all the time. They're beside themselves with happiness. All of the animals. Even the chickens are thriving. So that's been a silver lining of COVID, happy animals. And living there with Mike, Mike is I got married, for those of you who don't know, I got married in 2018. I met a 40-year National Forest Service ranger in 2017. Last thing I thought I was going to do was get married. I got married, and I do share the ranch with Mike, and it's great overall. The truth is I'm an only child, and I don't share space well I mean, I just need some alone time. And so I've managed to find it. But overall, it's great. He's excellent with the animals. The animals adore him. He's like made my Icelandic ram sweet. Like he's like a ram whisperer. And I'm so glad we were together for COVID. It would have been really different to be alone. I'm an only child and I like being alone, so I don't think I would have like gone crazy, but it's been lovely to be together and to be able to cook together and walk together. And I do think, I don't know, I have a really good and relatively new marriage, and I worry for those who don't at this time. But I also think if you do have a relatively good marriage, like it's so impossible to think, having gone through this thing, of not staying together, you know what I mean? Like it just feels like such a galvanizing experience this year in so many ways, the politics, but also COVID. Like, I think it's, in a weird way, it's been good for our marriage to be kind of locked down together. It's kind of either sink or swim in that situation, and we're swimming pretty well, as long as we give each other a little space. But thanks for asking. I would say overall it's going really well.
Okay, I think we just have one, maybe two left. Since you loved writing as a very young child, what is your advice to encourage creative writing in young children?
Yeah. I don't know about young children, And the reason I say that is, like, I wrote for survival in my household, so I would hope that, young children who are having a happy life would go outside and play more, which I did that too. I think in young children, I mean, I don't have children either, so this is not my area of expertise, but I would say, make them love story, like that's what happened to me, is that I got so interested in the idea that in a story you could transport yourself away from where you were, or you could celebrate where you were, wherever that was, and I think storytelling, like people ask me, like, what do I miss most during COVID? And everyone's going to thinks I'm going to say travel or airplanes or whatever. And I say, I miss sitting around a table with a bunch of other writers telling stories. Like, that's the thing I miss the most. By far, there's no contest, because that's kind of what my life is made of as I go around to teach here and there and there and there. Like, out to dinner, after class, everybody takes turns telling stories. And I think if you can make your household that way, where people do that, people feel comfortable doing that, and people, the young people are encouraged to do that, I think one of the reasons we're so divided as a country right now is that we don't know each other's stories. And I feel like our lives depend on telling stories. And when I see like a book like Tommy Orange's There, and a lot of people know that I was his teacher, and so a lot of people tell me how their book completely changed the way they understood how Native Americans live in this country, like in all kinds of ways, not just like how hard they have it, but also like just the fact of their daily lives, especially urban Native Americans, which a lot of people don't ever think about. Like, just that one book has opened, literally millions of people's eyes to the stories of urban natives in this century, in this country. And I just feel like if we can tell each other our stories, like then we can't like hate automatically, or we can't divide automatically. And so, I mean, this is a longer answer than has to do with small children, but I just think creating an atmosphere of storytelling is how you get students interested in writing. And maybe a lot of other good things too.
Well, we're getting some great feedback on your answers so far. I think we have time for one more, and it seems like a good closing question, so I saved it for the last. This writer asks, are you working on a new book? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I can. I mean, the real answer is I'm not exactly working on a book. I'm working on a lot of different projects, And one of them will probably be my next book, which is a collection of short stories. I wanted to go back to short stories because that's where I started with cowboys. And Deep Creek was really it was hard. Like, it was hard to write because it wasn't my idea. It was kind of their idea to write a memoir. And I didn't really know how to write a memoir. And I learned how to write a memoir by writing it. And that was a great experience, but it was hard and it took a long time. And so I wanted to have fun. Like, I wanted to take myself back to the fun of writing. And short stories for me are fun. I understand them through and through. I know how they work, or at least I know how mine work. So I'm writing a book of short stories with this character, Maggie. She tells all the stories. I'm writing in the close third person, which is different for me. I usually write in the first person or the second person, so that's been fun. Maggie was a clinical psychologist in a maximum security prison. We're back to stories again. So basically, she held space for the inmates' stories of pain and abuse, and also the stories of their crimes. And she's a character who came out of some work I got to do at the men's colony, the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. I got to work with some lifer prisoners there, men who were serving 25 or 35 to life. And I got to work on storytelling with them, and it was completely eye-opening, life-changing experience, so powerful. So she's now retired, but she's casting back and telling some of those stories, and she's also telling stories from her current life as a consultant to young PsyDs who are going to go into prisons. But she's also an outdoors woman, and she has dogs and all the things that I have. So she's also an alter ego for me. And then I'm doing a whole bunch of photo essays, which have been like COVID photo essays about being in the wilderness during COVID. And those are available. There's some published at a magazine called terrain.org, and there's some published in a magazine called Air/Light. And the other thing to say, I thought someone might ask, so I brought a copy up here. This book just came out, so this is actually my next book. This is a little book of letters. I know they have them at Book Bar because Amy and I did a reading there. Amy Irvine is an environmental writer who wrote a book called Desert Cabal, which was a talk back to Edward Abbey about how we should move in the desert. And Orion magazine, which is a wonderful magazine of nature and culture. If you don't know it, it's beautiful. They asked us to correspond and to write letters back and forth to each other when the stay-at-home order first came. Amy lives in Norwood, so she lives on the other side of the San Juans from me, about a 4-hour drive, about 75 miles apart as the crow flies. And so we wrote letters back and forth to each other, and they were published in this little volume called Airmail, Letters of Politics, Pandemics, and Place. And so this is actually my new book, and it's out. And it's just a little book. You can put it in your back pocket, and it's two women talking to each other about hopefully how to make a small difference and save the planet. And so if that's of interest to you, I hope you'll check it out. Yeah, so and then I'm just playing. I'm writing this for this anthology and that for that anthology. I might write a play over Christmas. I'm just having fun. Like, I'm trying to go back to my early days where I didn't owe anybody anything and I was just playing as an artist for a little while. But the next book will probably be the Maggie stories after Airmail.
Okay, thanks for joining us for this year's One Book, One Broomfield, Deep Creek, Finding Hope in the High Country by Pam Houston. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good night.
Thank you very much.